Infancy narratives of Jesus. The Magi. The second chapter of Matthew deals with the reactions to the Christological revelation in chapter 1 and constitutes a separate narrative, almost independent of the first narrative in chapter 1. It can be divided into two acts with the 5 scenes. The first act deals with the proclamation of Jesus and the acceptance by the Gentiles, and the second act deals with the rejection and persecution by Herod and the Jews. So we must know that each scene concludes with a form of formular quotation which may be present even implicitly. In the Act 1, the first scene is Magi come from the east, and it is concluded by Micah 5:1 and 2 Samuel 5:2. Second scene is Magi go to Bethlehem, implicit citation from Psalm 72:10 to 11 and Isaiah 60 verse 6. In Act 2, we have scene 3, the flight of Joseph, which is concluded by Hosea 11 verse 1, and scene 4 is massacre of the children, concluded by Jeremiah 31 verse 15, and scene 5 is the return of the family to Nazareth of Galilee, which is concluded by Isaiah 4:3 and maybe Judges 16:17. The story of the Magi and the star, like other stories in the infancy narrative of Matthew, echoes stories in the Old Testament, especially the Pentateuchal accounts of Moses, combined with the imaginary of a Messiah descended from David. This Pentateuchal passage in Numbers is from 22 to 24, the incident involving Balaam. The Matthean story seems to echo the Greek Septuagint version more closely than it echoes the Hebrew, since some of the items in Numbers 22-24 regarding this story, which we need to refer to, can only be found in the Greek version. When Moses was leading Israel to the Transjordanian region on the way to the Promised Land, he encountered another wicked king who, like the Pharaoh of Egypt, tried to destroy him. This was Balak, the king of Moab, who summoned from the east a famous seer named Balaam, who was to use his arts against Moses and Israel. Now, Balaam was a non-Israelite, an occult visionary, a practitioner of enchantment, in short, what would have been called in Jesus' time a Magnus. But we must remember that in the New Testament, this word Magnus or Magi covered a range of those engaged in occult arts like astronomers, fortune tellers, priestly augurs, and magicians of varying degrees of plausibility. So Matthew probably thinks of astronomers. He and his two servants came, but instead of cursing Moses and Israel, he had a favorable vision of the future. In Numbers 24 verses 7, he says the following: "There shall come a man out of Israel's seed, and he shall rule many nations. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not close. A star shall rise from Jacob, and a man, scepter, shall come forth from Israel." Almost certainly, this passage refers to the emergence of the Davidic monarchy. It was understood that David was the star that Balaam had foreseen, the man who would be given the scepter over the united kingdom of Judah and Israel. In later Judaism, the passage was taken as a reference to the Messiah, the anointed king of Davidic descent. The passage played a role in the 2nd century AD when Rabbi Akiba hailed as the Messiah the revolutionary Simon ben Kosheba, nicknamed Bar Kochba, which by popular etymology became the son of the star. The Herod of Matthew's story had the feature not only of the Pharaoh who tried to destroy the baby Moses by killing the male children of Hebrews, but also of King Balak, who sought to destroy Moses by means of a Magnus from the east. Just as Balaam saw the star of David rise, the New Testament Magi saw the star of the King of the Jews as its rising, as some translations have it, in the east. Besides the very implicit Old Testament imaginary, we have Matthew also using indirect Old Testament quotation from Micah 5:1 and 2 Samuel 5:2, which he has combined a more unique way to speak about this passage. When Micah is speaking of an exclusively Davidic king, the shepherd motive in 2 Samuel chapter 5 verse 2 protects an interpretation of Micah that would support an absolute ruler and offer backing for a tyrant like Herod. He must also remember that Matthew has his own understanding of a humble king as seen in chapter 21 verse 5. There is a second implicit quotation in scene 2. While the outline of the Magi narrative are taken from the story of Balaam, the narrative depicts them as kings coming with gifts as was described in Isaiah 60 verse 6. The Isaiah citation helps to underline the Gentile character of the Magi, but notice that while Isaiah only talks about gifts, he does not speak about paying homage. This illusion comes from Psalm 72 verse 10 and 11, which mentions Sheba and gifts and homage, and the whole combination is echoed in Matthew 2 verse 11. So these two sets of quotation reinforce the message of Matthew and try to bring it out with greater force that the formula of Micah 5:1 and 2 Samuel 5:2 in scene 1 emphasize the Davidic character and the fact that he is a king who will rule over Israel. The implicit citation of Isaiah 60 verse 6 and Psalm 72 verse 10 and 11 in scene 2 emphasizes the role as son of Abraham, in whom all the nations of the world are blessed, for at his birth are fulfilled the expectations that people and kings from Sheba and Saba would bring gifts and pay the king homage. The star that rose in the east is the star of the king of the Jews, but this king rules over the nations. Such a realization of Old Testament imaginary behind the Matthean story is important, but also important to realize how Matthew is using this story, second chapter of the Gospel, to describe the aftermath of the revelation of who Jesus is. The good news which Matthew has attached to the annunciation of the conception of Jesus, chapter 1, which usually consisted in the sequence of the proclamation of the good news to the Jews as well as the Gentiles, with the consequent a twofold response of acceptance and rejection. Things become a bit clearer when we begin to understand the historical aftermath or the consequence of revelation of the good news of salvation. A revelation that was initially attested to the resurrection of Jesus. But after resurrection of Jesus, the apostle went forth and proclaimed the good news first to Jews, then to the Gentiles. Proclamation of the kingdom throughout Galilee had twofold response. Some drew close to him and became his disciples, others rejected, came to hate him. So when the evangelists told stories of the conception of Jesus, attaching the revelation of Jesus' identity to the moment of his life, they also tend to follow the same sequence once more. In the second chapter of each infancy narrative, we hear how the good news was proclaimed to others and how it was accepted by some, rejected by the others. So the story of the Magi and the star becomes for Matthew the anticipation of the fate of the good news of salvation, a fate that he knew in the aftermath of the resurrection. First, the Christological good news draws believers, and those believers, the Magi, are the Gentiles. Remember that Matthew is writing his gospel from a very advantage point in time when his church had become predominantly Gentile. He knows that Jesus confined himself to Israel, but he expands the parable of the wicked tenants to allow for a transfer to the Gentiles. Yet the evangel is also Jewish enough to continue the tradition of not depriving the scriptures to the Gentiles, and never had so explicit a revelation as was given to the Jews. It is through nature that God revealed himself to the Gentiles, and so Matthew shows that Magi receiving a revelation through astrology. The birth star associated with the king of the Jews brings them the good news of salvation. This is an imperfect revelation, for while it tells them of the birth, it does not tell them where they can find the king of the Jews. So the ultimate secret of his whereabouts is locked in the special revelation of God to Israel in the scriptures. So the Gentiles come to worship, but they must learn from the Jews the history of salvation. Then Matthew highlights the paradox that those who have the scriptures and can see plainly what the prophets have said are not willing to worship the newborn king. To the contrary, the king and the chief priests and the scribe conspire against the Messiah, especially the verse 2:20, to allude to their plot to kill him later on. And the wicked king disagrees his death, but God spares Jesus, ultimately brings back his son from another land in verse 2:15. In other words, stories reflecting the Old Testament about Joseph, Moses and Balaam have now been worked into a unified anticipation of the passion and the resurrection narrative. The same cast of characters is present. The secular ruler, the chief priests and the scribes are aligned against Jesus, who has only God on his side. But God makes Jesus victorious by bringing him back, and in this process those who have the scripture find him and adore him. The Matthean story is not only gospel, the good news of salvation, but it is essential gospel story in miniature. They are also the most loved stories of the Bible. This was not only due to appreciation of a good story that was satisfying to the emotion and sentiment, but also reflects a Christian instinct recognizing therein the essence of the good news. That is, that God has made himself present to us, Emmanuel, in the life of one who walked on this earth. This revelation was an offense and a contradiction to some, but salvation to those who had the eyes to see. Of the latter, the Magi are truly the forerunners, the anticipation of all those who would come to worship the risen Jesus proclaimed by the apostles. The book of Numbers presented Balaam as one from the east who could say, I see him. But now, since the star would not rise from Jacob until David's time, so also the Matthean Magi, in seeing the star of the King of the Jews as it's rising, see the one whose kingship would not be visible historically until he was hung on the cross.